Welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast where we inspire growth, beat down biases, and get into all sorts of good trouble, with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East.
No topic is off limits as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
So get ready to join us for some courageous conversation, because Not Going Quietly starts right now.
Hey everyone, welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast for outraged optimists and heartbroken healers all over the world, where we surface life's searing truths in the name of radical togetherness. I'm your host, Britt East, and my co-host, Jonathan Beal, unfortunately is still on sabbatical, but I've got great news for you. We have a wonderful featured guest today, and we're going to explore some really juicy topics. Let me read you his bio by way of introduction so you can get to know him. Christopher S. Reigeluth, PhD, is an assistant professor, clinical psychologist, and author. He serves on the faculty at Oregon Health and Science University and practices as a child and adolescent psychologist and teaches. He completed his doctoral training at Clark University and a fellowship at the Yale University Child Study Center. Dr. Reigeluth's research explores the psychological implications of masculine gender socialization for boys. He is passionate about boys' and men's well-being and greater gender awareness for all people. Dr. Reigeluth is on the editorial board for Psychology of Men and Masculinities and chairs the APA Division 51 Task Force on Boys in School. He is the author of The Masculinity Workbook for Teens: Discover What Being a Guy Means to You. Dr. Reigeluth spent 5 years on the faculty at Pacific University School of Graduate Psychology before joining OHSU. He is married, has 2 children, and loves the outdoors. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast as a featured guest. How are you?
Good. Thanks, Britt. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, this could not be more timely. I mean, I guess this topic is always timely.
Always, yeah.
But, with what's going on, we're recording this in June 2023, and with what's going on in the world, there's some issues with masculinity in U.S. Culture and society. So with that being said, why did you write the Masculinity Workbook for Teens? Who's it for? Why did you choose to make it a workbook? What's in it? How should people read it? Just tell us some about it.
Yeah. Well, as a child and adolescent psychologist, and when I got into PhD training, and we can go down this path at some point if we do, but I was really drawn to boys' development and boys' well-being, and ended up doing my graduate studies with Michael Addis, who was focused on masculinities and mental health and help seeking. And so clinically, I had that interest, right? Like, boys and mental health, how are they doing? And as part of just getting into the path of learning about this area, right? In addition to my own lived experience as a teen and, at that point as, in my 20s, it became very apparent that while parents are being educated and mentors and adults are being educated a lot on, maybe not a lot, but much more so than, in the past, on how boys are being led astray with gender socialization messages and masculine norms, and that's creating barriers for lots of them, and some really big barriers and problems. The boys aren't being spoken to themselves, right? We're talking to their parents, right? We're talking to caregivers, we're talking to mentors about, how things aren't going well for boys, but we're not talking to the boys themselves. And so that really was the goal of this book. Like, let's talk to the boys. Let's have them be part of this conversation and give them a chance to do something about these concerns that at least some adults have.
Yeah, that's so cool. My husband is a middle school counselor, and I had him read your book.
Okay, wow!
As part of preparing for this episode, and he loved it, and I adored it as well. And one of the things I so enjoyed about it is the sense of curiosity that you spark. from the reader, and which I think is a precursor to empathy, is that you start to question assumptions, start to look at your own life journey, even as a teen, what you've experienced so far, and you start to get curious about what other people might be experiencing in a kind of a shame-free container. I think it's pretty well understood that shame is not a change agent, and like you alluded to, it's so tempting to have these conversations about boys and not with boys. It's so tempting to over pathologize and say, boys are everything that's wrong with the world. Why would I want to talk to them when clearly, nothing can be further from the truth. If you believe we're all in this together, then of course it's imperative that we actually engage with each other and as, subject to subject in human relationships, and rather than just kind of talk around them in these awkward, hallway conversations. What are we going to do about these boys? How are we going to fix them? But your book actually directly engages boys. And I can't help but wonder, how are you geared for this? I mean, you grew up in this society, you were a boy once. It's like, where did this come from? This impulse to help other guys out there?
Oh, maybe you should have invited my parents on, or somebody who had that perspective. Yeah. In thinking about my own journey, and just to kind of go through some quick chunks, right? I can remember, guy code pressures that all guys experience, right? Not all guys buy into them, right? But all guys at least, right? If you ask people, what are the masculinity pressures, right? Whether you agree with them or not, I've really, whether I'm in a room of conservatives or liberals or kind of a mix, I've never really had disagreement on what the messages and teachings are, right? People can identify them. But I think what's important to acknowledge is boys don't take them in all the same. Some boys are very resistant to masculine norms, and Niobe Way's work has captured that. And the movie Close that has come out, which is kind of based on her research on boys and friendships. Right? Lots of boys are kind of more in the middle, right? They do some of it, other stuff they don't really do because it's just, it feels too aversive to them. And then, a smaller percentage of boys, but the boys that get the most attention conform in the most extreme, more rigid ways. And certainly when I think about my pathway, to kind of get back to your question, going through middle school, I definitely, I was in a society where there wasn't any invitations to question. It was a white, middle to upper class suburban area with good school systems. At that point, it would have been the 80s and 90s. And the queer movement was a lot more muted. There weren't many people who were out of the closet with regards to kind of, gay, lesbian, transgender, right? All of those things were just much more quiet. And not as apparent. And so there weren't opportunities to question. There weren't invitations to question. The model was cisgender, heterosexual masculinity, right, in its truest forms. And so I wasn't questioning. I was trying to conform. And I was fine at sports, but I wasn't good enough at sports to kind of fully meet those ideals. And I enjoyed singing and gravitated towards the choir, which is considered to be an unmasculine or non-masculine thing. And so I had kind of just this interesting hybrid of some things about me that fit the mold and were more clearly in the masculinity box, and other things that didn't, but I so wanted to, right? I so wanted to live up to those ideals. And, be a fully anointed, accepted guy based on, society's mold, which when you get into high school, then really starts to be about proving yourself as a player and heterosexual success. And as I got into high school, it started to feel less and less comfortable to me to do this masculinity performance. And I think I'd been trying so hard up to that point to fit in, and I just got like fed up of trying so hard. It was like, this just doesn't feel right for me. And so my last two years of high school, I got bitter and was unhappy, but I at least was kind of like, like that, like stuff, like that masculinity stuff, and having to, constantly be proving myself to other people just isn't working. And I'm like sick of kind of doing it. And so I was kind of more, frankly, I had friends, but I was also more isolated. And then got to college and, found a bigger world, beyond my small white suburban neighborhood with more options and more identities beyond the guy box. And, some things I'll usually mention as part of my, what I really would refer to as enlightenment was getting to college and taking gender, race, and the politics of difference. And the first day I walked in, like, I mean, from what I could tell appearance wise, I was the only masculine male identifying student. And it was a teacher taught by Cheshire Calhoun. And it was incredibly eye opening. And I remember getting pissed off because learning about gender, right? This socially constructed thing that changes across history, right? That is not static, that society imposes and comes up with, was really presented in a way of, let's think about this critically, right? And this does not need to be so imposed. You can actually like decide how you want to be, right? Sex is more tricky, right? That's a trickier thing, but gender is actually like, it comes from society, right? And society has these expectations, but you don't have to follow those, right? You can be in the box, you can be out of the box, you can be a mix of things. And I was pissed. I was like, why am I, with all the privilege I've had, all the good education I've had, why am I 20 or 21 taking this course and realizing this stuff for the first time? Because you know what? If somebody had sat me down earlier and kind of invited me to question and invited me to explore for myself, high school would have been a lot less painful. So those are the emotional reasons that I wrote the book, right? With some of kind of the scholarly journey, but kind of part of the pain that I went through, and really feeling like this is an education that everyone needs, right? Kind of, boys need it with regard to the masculinity stuff that's going to be thrust upon them and imposed. And they need caring, thoughtful adults to help them make sense of that in a way that feels genuine and authentic for them, wherever that leads. And that's a really important part of the workbook, right? It's not telling boys this is how you should be. Right? Really, the goal of the workbook is, this is the guy code. These are the masculine norms that researchers have actually established, which is why I put citations in there so the boys can see, oh, this stuff is actually like established by people with degrees. And I can follow some of it, I can follow all of it, or I can follow none of it, right? But at least go through the critical process of being invited to question and explore for yourself. So That's why.
That's so beautiful. That's so beautiful. And one of the things I love about that is how you unintentionally allude to the fact that you're not special, that you have been the beneficiary of all this wonderful education and training and support and love and all that, but you're just a regular person who experienced something in society and it irked you, and that served as the impulse to drive some change and to help others. And so if you can do it, we all can do it. Meaning if young Christopher can think, wow, this sucks, how can I do something different, experience more liberation, more freedom, more happiness, then the rest of us can make similar choices too, as well. And I guess you kind of alluded to this. I guess what I'm thinking next is, we've on this podcast, we've done a number of episodes around masculinity. And one of the things I started to think about is like, while we haven't had the chance, we've mainly focused on lived experience, but we haven't had the chance to talk to an expert like you. And so that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to have you on the show. And I started thinking in my research, I started thinking like, okay, what would you do, Dr. Reigeluth, if you were called to testify on the Senate panel in 2023 to answer the favorite question from certain segments of the society, which is, what is a man? How would you respond to that?
Oh, I would say I'm too tired. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. Contact me next year, and maybe I can't leave home right now.
That'd be good self-care.
What is a man? What a great question, Britt. I mean, it's certainly something. In some ways, I think about. In other ways, right, I choose to more just question.
Yeah.
Right.
Let me interrupt
question that construct. But yeah.
Let me interrupt real quickly just to frame it a little bit further, because I struggle with this, and I get the gender construct and how gender is culturally constituted and all of that. But for me, the labels have never resonated. And you talk about this in your book, about how many of the virtues that we ascribe to masculinity could be equally ascribed to femininity. And then makes me start to think, like, what's it all for? Like, have you ever known anybody stronger or more courageous than a single mom? So it's like, what equity, what utility am I getting out of gendering myself? Now, society genders me in a specific way, and I get all sorts of privilege out of that. But I'm just talking about my relationship with myself. And so I've thought a lot about, agender, post-gender, do I require a label? What does this mean for me? Where do I fit in? What does it mean to be gay if I don't even necessarily resonate with the word man or masculine? What is, so part of it's provocative in that these questions are asked as sort of gotcha questions by people from certain political quarters trying to impose rigid gender norms on society. But from my personal journey, it's like, I kind of get hung up on it.
Yeah. Well, I've got your question written down, so I won't stray too far from it. But what I was just thinking about when you were mentioning the different ideals and characteristics, and other groups need some of this stuff too, right? Why is it treated as being exclusive to boys and men and masculinity, bravery, power, dominance, self-reliance, right? These are all established masculine norms. And I was asked that question when I gave a presentation a number of years ago at a men's eating disorder conference. And I was asked, why are you focusing so much on the ways that masculinity is problematic for guys? Why aren't you also focusing on all the good stuff? And my response was, because I don't see the good stuff as being reserved for guys. Right? I don't see bravery and caregiving and self-reliance as within the essence of what it means to be a guy, right? I see society kind of thrusting that forward. But when I look around at trans people and, people on the, gender spectrum, and women and girls, right? Just as you said, right? I know plenty of people of other genders who also have those important characteristics. And where those characteristics can lead to problems more for boys and men is when there's so much pressure to have to do that stuff all the time, to do the be strong or do the brave or do the self-reliance stuff all the time, that you can't ask for help, or that you shut down the vulnerable part of yourself that we all have, but that boys and men historically haven't had as much societal permission or encouragement to also show sadness and worry and insecurity and those things that make all of us humans. So that's a little bit of an aside, but I think is important to make note of, because there is a universality to some of these things, and it raises questions. Why do we treat this as just specific and part of one group when we look around, open your eyes, and it's actually part of people of all different backgrounds.
And, my theory is that it goes back to patriarchy and preserving bloodlines and lineages, inheritance rights. But I'm talking about more in terms of the value. Like, I get why it's done to oppress people, but it's like, what is the value for me as a person? And I don't know that there's an answer. I just wrestle with it. But it made me think about, my favorite part of your book, frankly, are the hysterical and beautiful and funny and eye-opening testimonials. That's not the right word. Quotes from the primary sources, the guys, the kids, the boys that you interviewed in your research. They're so real and raw.
Yeah, and those are boys of all backgrounns.
Yeah.
And I had the race and ethnicities listed in there originally, but the publisher decided they didn't want those to be included. But yeah, those are boys of all different backgrounds.
Yeah, and it's so great because one of the things that, if you kind of look for what's not said, is none of them that I can remember are questioning. I guess they all have the answer. In other words, like, they all know exactly what masculinity is. They've been taught early. And so I guess my question to you is when are we first taught to perform gender, and how does that transmission work?
Well, of course it depends. But and it is going to vary, but we know that most boys and girls start to understand this gender stuff, and that there are groupings and that there are differences, that kind of different expectations for boys versus girls, and ways of being, ways of dressing, ways of playing with toys as young as 3, maybe even earlier. My son Finn, comes from a house with a dad who really tried to just keep stereotypical kind of boy toys out of the house, but he was introduced to them in other sources and from kind of nursery school and what other kids are saying with big brothers. And Finn is an interesting kid in that he's into some of the stereotypical boy stuff, but he also puts a dress on because he enjoys doing that sometimes, right? And other times he'll be wearing Spider-Man stuff. And so it's just kind of this hodgepodge. When he plays with other girls, he loves doing dress up, but he also loves smashing trucks and things. And my guess is for lots of us, if we really were left more to our own devices, we would look more hodgepodgey in our interests and in kind of stuff that we try out and try on and gravitate towards. And so I guess I'm just giving that example because, that's an example of, at least this point, he seems to be mostly identifying as a boy, but at other times is more questioning. He's in Portland, right? Which just from a political standpoint is a pretty progressive, rebellious city. And there's lots of, he's been exposed to lots more gender diversity than I was with the neighborhood I grew up in. And yet as a 3-year-old, he still is showing that he's seeing these differences. And it's raising questions for him and confusion for him at times. And so most kids start to get social learning as soon as they enter the world. Some kids get it earlier when, for parents, which, this is perfectly fine. People need to make their decisions, but, gender reveal parties and really setting up, rooms in very boy versus girl ways, pink versus blue, and the toys and the clothes are all prepped and my family knows. So they're buying all that stuff. I mean, those kids are getting a big dose of it as soon as they go into that room, right? As 2 or 3 days old, right? Some kids, some boys pretty young start to get the message big boys don't cry. Or big boys shouldn't cry as much, right? Right? Research has shown that even though boys are actually more vulnerable and emotionally expressive and get tweaked about stuff more when they're kind of right out of the womb and really young, they're not as resilient. right? As socialization starts to happen, they're not given as much room for their emotions, right? They'll kind of get messages to clean that stuff up more quickly in those younger years than girls do. And so it starts really early.
Yeah.
And you know, in varying doses, depending on the family and the family's values. But even families coming from a much more kind of gender egalitarian, non-traditional, wanting to keep, you know, the upbringing as kind of non-gendered as possible. You can't keep your kid from society, and society still kind of approaches gender through a binary approach and with these traditional norms.
And that's what,
and there are more representations than there used to be, right? Of people from kind of non-traditional.
And I think that's what's so great about your book is like, you're not saying let's do away with gender. You're not saying let's avoid it. It's like trying to keep your kid away from a cell phone or candy or a video game or something. It's not gonna happen. So it's much more empowering to educate each other and to recognize what's real and to be open, honest, and authentic, and then to create space for people to play, for kids to paint with all sorts of different colors, however the spirit moves them in any given moment. And so they can be dressing up in a dress one moment and playing with trucks in another moment, and it's all good. And I love that. And so it got me thinking, and you go at, you know, you talk at length about this in the book, and you alluded to it just now, is about the guy code. Some people call it man box culture. There's various names, but what is it? How is it transmitted? Why does it exist? And what does it cost us?
Yeah. So let's get into that. And I do still have your question written down of like the value of a man. So I know I avoided that one a bit, but let's get back to that one at some point.
Yeah.
Well, boys and men are diverse, right? And that's important to say, right? Whether you're talking about, you know, boys and men who are white, or boys and men of color, or boys and men, you know, who have, you know, all different cultural backgrounds, intersectional backgrounds, you know, sexual orientations. Boys and men are diverse, and we see that when we look around, right? In terms of how, right? I mean, you see it more in kind of big cities. But in spite of these guy code pressures, the boilerplate, the template is not, I think, does not do as good a job as society would like it to be in terms of like what comes out on the other side of the machine. And for me, that when people ask me, but isn't a lot of this stuff based on biology, or isn't a lot of kind of like how guys are based on their genetics and based on testosterone and having penises and this other stuff? My answer is, well, for one, we can't really do anything about the biological and the chemical and the testosterone. I mean, people look into that research, and kind of that research is mixed in terms of the role that it plays. But what is a compelling outcome for me is that I look around and I actually I know plenty of boys and men who are emotionally vulnerable, in spite of the painful messages that they got growing up to stuff that and to suck it up and to don't be a this and to don't be a that, right? Misogynistic, homophobic, don't be those things, right? Boys get those messages, and in spite of that, plenty of them kind of turn out in ways that go against and that transcend those messages. And lots also don't, right? And that can be very painful for those boys as well, right? Who can't really express their full emotional colors. Right? But there is this diversity. And so to me, that kind of points to, yeah, sure. The biology stuff plays a role, right? There are hormones and chemicals, and that does kind of create at least this sex type group, right? Of males, right? Because that would be the right term to use, right? This male sex type that has these organs. But the gender stuff we can actually do something about. And so, you know, to kind of get back to your question of like, how are boys socialized? I mean, it's going to depend, right? But what we know, and, you know, when I give presentations, I always show this stuff is, right, if you look in the magazines, you'll see most magazines, you'll see pictures of women wearing really revealing clothing and portrayed in really objectifying ways, right? That's not hard to find. It's also not hard to find lots of pictures of guys in kind of men being portrayed in these like hyper muscular, like super intense, ruthless, you know, physical, beating people up kind of ways, right? So those images are very prevalent, like how toys are presented to guys, right? And even as young as in nursery school, boys are starting to get exposed to guns and video games. And, oh, isn't it fun to like play guns with killing people? And so that, right, all of that stuff is part of the social fabric, right? The toys that are given to boys, the fact that in books that kids read, there are more male protagonists and there are more kind of boy-man characters in roles of power and control, right? So that leaves a message, right? Whether you're a boy, girl, or a kid of another gender, right? That leaves a message, right? Boys and men are a stronger group, right? I played the movie The Little Mermaid for Finn the other day because he'd like heard about it at school, and it's rated G, and we generally let him watch rated G stuff. And I was like so uncomfortable about like how heteronormative it was, and just kind of like this, you know, strapping, you know, sailor prince character who, you know, Ariel the mermaid is trying to get, and he has all the power, right? And, you know, she has to kiss him, and so much of the movie is about like her kissing him, and you know, she's portrayed in very sexual ways. And so those representations aren't as prevalent probably as when you and I were growing up, Britt, right? I think if somebody was able to break it down, and some people do look at this of like a percentage of like movies coming out and shows, right, that are heteronormative and heterosexual and have these kind of powerful male masculine characters, that percentage has gone down, right? But that percentage is still very kind of much weighted in these kind of classic, more idealized, you know, cisgender, heteronormative, you know, representations of athletic strapping men, right? Who are in control, where frequently the goal is to kick ass, right? And then have sex, right? So those representations are everywhere.
It's funny that
and kids get exposed to it.
It's funny that you mentioned that because I was thinking that it's not just the heteronormativity of like movies like Little Mermaid, and that's just one movie. It's the fact that we're saturated in that kind of content is the issue. It's
yeah.
You know, as a gay man, I've witnessed many segments of our community kind of worship at the altar of masculinity more than maybe any other segment of our community. So you're even distorting queer identities and queer self-expression when that's the only
totally,
you know, norm that you see in movies. And so it's like not even just that it's another man and another woman and the whole world is revolving around are they going to kiss or not, but it's also, you know, even if you're having fun as a little queerling watching the movie, you're getting one flavor of manhood presented to you. And so then when you become a gay man, then inadvertently, one of the unintended consequences, or maybe it's very intended, is that you worship at that altar of one kind of masculinity, that man box, that guy code, and it leads to all sorts of negative self-limiting beliefs around who I should be with. Am I attracted? Is my body okay? It's pretty easy to connect those dots. And it got me thinking while you're talking, why is it so dangerous or expensive for men to be seen as silly, tender, or caring?
Yeah. Well, I think to be silly, to laugh is actually like, that's a vulnerable emotion, right? That's a vulnerable thing where you're letting down your guard, where you don't have full control in that moment, right? But somebody else has control of kind of like bringing out this kind of like warm flurry of emotional stuff inside of you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that for me is why those specific emotions, kind of laughter, silliness, kind of goofiness, kind of bigger overtures of warmth, do feel dangerous to a lot of boys and men because they are vulnerable. It's right. It's not the classic vulnerability we think about with like, I'm depressed or I'm sad or I'm worried or insecure, but you have to give yourself in some ways up over to another person in those moments to really like wholeheartedly engage in that laughter with them. Right. And also kind of let somebody else impact you in those ways that isn't coming from you, or isn't coming from you acting on your environment.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, as a society, and I think it's gotten more and more so, but I don't know, that's just my perception as a layperson. We've deemed it almost unsafe to allow men close proximity to children, except in very specific scenarios. I mean, just look at the dearth of male preschool and kindergarten teachers. And I was thinking about that when I was talking with my husband, like I said, as a middle school counselor, about your book. And I got to thinking like, and I did not ask him this. I'll talk with him about it later. I was like, would you choose that career today? Would you not be petrified that, you would be ostracized professionally, that you'd be living with danger, frankly? I mean, of course, there's lots of dynamics involved, but part of it is social sexual shame. And, you know, it's like meaning any guy involved in human services must either be gay or have some sort of nefarious agenda. So, you know, and following up to my previous question, it made me think like, well, what are the unintended costs and consequences of denying men access to the magic of children, the unique joy and magic that children bring into the world? We sever men from that connection in the public sphere, not in the house with their own children. That's one thing, but I'm talking about in the public sphere. It seems like something is lost.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. And we can look at it in job roles, in addition to the very, you know, for many of us, you know, who have kids, right? Our most important job is being a parent, right? And that also involves kind of kids, and kind of really being able to like connect with kids more meaningfully, which requires vulnerability. In the documentary, The Mask You Live In, which, you know, anyone should watch if you haven't, it was put out by Jennifer Siebel Newsom, and it really takes it's a critical exploration of masculinities and stuff in this society through the voices of boys and men of all different backgrounds. But there's a segment when, I forget the name of the researcher, but essentially they are kind of talking about work that they've done looking at dads and their kids. And they'll, highlight ways that when dads are with like their babies, there's a softness and there's a gentleness. And it's almost like they are connecting with something that they had been forced to kind of push away and cut off, but are realizing in those moments with their young kids that it's so precious, both for me and for my young baby, to be able to kind of like nurture and bring that back. Right. And let my guard down in these moments and kiss my kid and laugh and be silly, and show nurturance and love and affection in ways that, you know, I haven't been as accustomed to in years because of how I was raised. Right. And then Niobe Way's work kind of as a building on that. And I don't want to get too researchy, but has also kind of like highlighted the bind that a lot of dads will be in. Right. Like, I can still kind of connect to some of the pains of kind of my growing up experience in times when I got shut down, or policed, right? Had my masculinity policed because I wasn't doing the right thing, and it was painful, but it also was required for survival in this society. And I don't know what to do, right? Do I keep nurturing the emotional stuff in my young boy who's now getting older? Or do I try to like help train him for the harsh realities of masculinity and what's expected in the world?
That's really heartrending. My goodness. I do not have children. Marriage was literally beyond my wildest dreams, much less fatherhood, given the place and the time I grew up. And, you alluded to this it seems like fatherhood can be a gateway, a port key to, experiencing the tenderness and silliness and vulnerability in a way that in certain situations is socially prized and accepted, quickly punished in other scenarios. But it can be a way maybe for men, one of many ways probably, mentorship. Like I was thinking big brothers, big sisters. There's lots of ways to experience kind of parenthood writ large, but can be a way to remember somatically in their body what it's like to laugh with abandon, like in that silly childlike way, to maybe if they're having a parenting experience, I'll put quotes around it, meaning, casting a broader net, with like a young person who likes to have tea parties and dance around in dresses. Maybe it's a socially acceptable way for men to play in that space and then reclaim and remember who they are somatically, energetically, imaginatively. And it seems like it can be a really beautiful, transformative thing. And it got me thinking about you, because you talk so beautifully about the way you're parenting and your past. Is how has parenting your kids changed you as a man, as a masculine person? And how has it, and what kind of alternative expressions of masculinity have you now allowed yourself to explore and play with?
Yeah, and I'll answer that. And first I'm going to go off on a tangent because it reminded me of something I wanted to say earlier, which was parents, caregivers, mentors, uncles, aunts, older relatives, right, are so important as part of this equation, right? I mean, parents are too, right? But any older person in a kid's life is so important. And right, we can explore all of the gender socialization stuff, and we can look at the examples, and they're pretty clear and apparent of how these messages are conveyed. And, parents and caregivers and mentors, right, then also have an opportunity to like be in that young person's life and to, invite them to explore things more on their own. Which I think is so important. And when you were getting into the socialization stuff, something that I wanted to just say, really just like a question to put out there for all of us, is like, and if I talk to parents individually or caregivers or kind of just adults about this, like usually there's consensus, although I do live in Portland, right? Like, why are video games so violent, right? Why are so many of our movies like so violent? Why do we have toy guns?
Oh, God.
Right? Like, why do we have toy guns? Right? As a society. Like, sure, like army, like military, police, give them guns, right? Like hunting, right? I mean, I know that's like an amendment, right? So like, sure, like lock up your guns and go hunting. But why do we give toy guns? And why are video games like so graphic with regard to sexual objectification of women and kind of women in compromised positions and portraying these men, whether it's Grand Theft Auto or other stuff, right? And so many boys are just absorbing, right, that media, right? Like, why are we okay with that? Why aren't there more outcries, right? When us adults like walk down the street, right, in New York City or wherever else, and just like see these toxic billboards, right, that our kids also are taking in, right? And so I'm not going to answer that, but I wanted to put that out there because I think it's an important message for parents and mentors and people who care about boys to just think about, well, if I'm not okay with that, like, how can I like push back more actively and raise questions of it, because it is such a big part of the societal soup. But I can also like push back against it more actively. And so parents are important. And so now to answer your question about how parenting changed me, right? And of course, right, parents need to talk to their kids about porn and all that stuff, which we can go into, because boys are now seeing porn. Like 90 or 95% of boys see porn by 8th grade because of social media and being given phones that have internet on them. And the parental controls don't really work. So that's something else that maybe we'll get into. But parenting did change me, because as much as I was doing this research and I was thinking more critically about gender and masculinity, I don't feel like I could as fully like walk the walk of my own kind of like being more transcendent and like how I really wanted to be as a person, how I really wanted to be emotionally, how I wanted to be with regard to silliness and letting my guard down, until my kids came along. And I feel like that really opened up, right, as I'm feeling emotions coming up, but like really opened up the doors, just like them being there, right? These two little beings who are so authentic, right? And so have their guard down and are just like opening up their arms to the world and to silliness and to laughter and to wanting to snuggle and crying and showing emotions like in such true, genuine ways, right? I mean, what amazing teachers. And so, for me, my kids, Finn and Fern, kind of, I think, like brought me back, kind of closer to my original core, right? Of just kind of like who I am, right? And what feels good for me when, right, society kind of doesn't kind of have as much influence, right? And I think, that whether it's me or you or anyone else, like socialization is real, right? And even as much as I can question it, right, I didn't really start to actively like critically question it until like my prefrontal cortex was fully developed as a 25-year-old, right? So lots of brain development and channels and kind of like, kind of neural like solidification like happened during all of those years, right? And so as much as you kind of like then start to like decide, right, if that's what your decision is, because that's not the pathway for everyone, right? The important thing is just to question, right? And see what you want. But it can be painful when you recognize that like these things haven't been good for me, right? And I want more liberation and freedom and emotional expressivity and creativity. And like my brain doesn't bend as easily in those ways anymore. But I feel like my kids have really kind of like helped with just like an opening up, freeing process. And, alternative expressions for me, at least, kind of from how I was raised, a lot of my, expressions come from just what I say, how I communicate. I think just like the presence I set with just kind of what I say and communicate. I think because of like how I was raised and how my brain developed, like it doesn't feel, doesn't feel authentic to me to like put on a dress or to put on a skirt. Like maybe it would if that had been like invited into my childhood more. Although of course I like, support everyone wearing dresses and skirts, right, as much as possible. But I think what has changed for me is just getting like more silly in my dress. Like I have lots of articles in my wardrobe and vests and things, although I'm not wearing one today, that just have lots of color, right? Lots of brightness. And growing up, I wore more traditional like boy and guy stuff. And like now I have like more things in my wardrobe that would be considered just more, flamboyant and colorful and fun and silly. And so that's probably the biggest thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was so beautiful the way, earlier you kind of alluded to it and you came back to it. Now, the bind that fathers are in, maybe all parents are in, where you simultaneously have this access to magic with from the children that give you this permission slip in certain moments to re-experience or experience for the first time, to play, if only by proximity, and enjoy a certain freedom that only children have, especially small children have. Yet you also have to get them ready for the real world. And that bind, okay, what is it like to live in a masculine dominant culture? Even though we've created this safe haven for you as young children, you're about to go into public school or preschool or wherever you're going, you're going to get the messages even before. And so, how do we balance that? And it made me think about, it just seems like so much of our culturally conditioned displays of masculinity, at least in today's world, are tied to our particular flavor of capitalism, which is this weird zero-sum game that we play, at least in the US, with securing land, winning money, maintaining bloodlines for inheritance. And I was wondering, and this may be outside of your expertise, so you don't have to go there if you don't feel like it, but how can we start to decouple gender expression from capitalism in a way that nurtures intimacy and fosters human richness?
Wow, let me take that in. So, decoupling gender from capitalism. Yeah, right, in a way that's more authentic and more nurturing.
Like you talked about the billboards you might see in Times Square of sexualized women on display as objects. And, it just seems like so much of it is all cut from the same cloth.
Right. Yeah. Profit, power, status, right? And
Land.
White men are still the ones, who hold most of those purse strings, right? Even though, right, not quite as much as they used to. They still hold most of them for sure.
Yeah.
For me, the biggest thing is, all sorts of examples of, pushing back against, the patriarchy and against those, patriarchal capitalist systems. And we push back in all sorts of ways, right? From you and I having this conversation today, from, educating parents on these issues as much as possible so that they can be more actively involved in really raising their kids, right? For those who feel this way, raising their kids in ways that feels authentic to them, right? And recognizing that you can't keep your kid from society and those pressures, right? But if enough of us are starting to push back and question, right? And then we start to bring it to more systemic levels of like, hey, schools, right? And I talk about this, and I've done some work in this area, especially with the task force on boys in school, like, hey, schools, right? Like, you are so influential in our kids' lives, and social and emotional learning is starting to get on your radar more and more, right? And for boys in particular, right, with how they get socialized and their social learning, emotional restriction, right, is something that happens. And so can you be part of the solution, right, in this regard, right? Just as you're, right, and this isn't going to happen in Florida, but it can happen in some other places, right? Just as you're like doing such important education of our kids with like the math and right, the book stuff and art, right? Can we also like kind of more deeply include social emotional learning and gender-based education, right? So that the kids aren't the ones having to figure out, like, how do we do this? What does it mean to be a guy, right? Yeah. Kind of, developing all kind of boy groups because like that's what they see, and like no girls allowed. Like, as adults, can we actually like help them navigate this gender stuff that they start to absorb and then like reenact and perform in ways that can be problematic and limiting? Like, can we like help them out with that more? And can schools help them out with that more, right? And so then you can kind of like get up to that level of system of change, right? And I think from there, as more and more people know, like, change does have a chance to happen. And then those billboards can get more critique. There was in a PowerPoint that I gave recently, it's the clothing designer, I think it's like Dolce & Gabbana, right? I showed an advertisement that, I mean, maybe it's a decade old at this point, but there is, right? And this was definitely in a magazine, but it could have been on a billboard. There is a woman who's like scantily dressed. She's like very fashionable, right? But she's like down on her back and her hands are out and her kind of like legs are opened up a little bit. And there's a man who's also like dressed in Dolce & Gabbana, like over her, right? And it kind of feels sexual, right? She is the one being dominated. But then there are these guys standing around.
Oh my
right.
God.
And so it's not just the two of them. Right. And so it literally, like, as I was, looking at it in this new way, I was like, it's like this idealized gang rape.
Exactly.
Is about, and this is in like a Dolce & Gabbana thing, right? Which, I can't afford their stuff, I don't think. But I think, they're like a very well-known clothing company and they're like out there and their ads are out there and they get absorbed. And so, pushing back against that stuff more. And I think there will be more societal pushback and politicians will care more when just society in general has this issue more on their radar. And when more parents really feel like they're given encouragement and permission to like question, right? And push back, right? And kids need to be encouraged to like have choices and to think more critically and not just have to absorb this gender stuff.
Yeah, we've focused a lot on the younger kids in our conversation today. Let's expand it a little bit based on what we were just talking about. It seems like in some societies throughout history there have been all sorts of rites of passage designed to symbolize the ascent into manhood, the transfer of boys from their mothers to the community. Maybe they perform feats of strength or endurance or heroism, overcoming their fears, whatever is important to that society. But these rites signify a transition into manhood. And I was thinking about our own rites of passage in contemporary U.S. society and thinking about, things like graduating from high school or high school prom or homecoming dance and I was thinking if any of these traditions exist in contemporary cultures that you think imbue a sense of healthy masculinity and secure manhood. And if not, because I'm assuming they don't, if not, how can we create them? And maybe that was kind of going to your previous point. It's like, how can we again, start to decouple capitalism from gender, lay as elders, parents or not, lay a secure foundation for these kids who are coming up and then help them bridge that gap by creating either ceremonies or cultural transmission points or rites of passage so that they feel freer and more liberated to be who they truly are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, with regard to these rituals and coming of age type things, you certainly see change in a city like Portland with regard to just, what kids are being exposed to, what boys are being exposed to. More students, many more students in the Portland public schools who are representing themselves in non-binary, right, or kind of more openly like identifying as trans. And then that has an opportunity for, people from, other, non-cisgender straight backgrounds to kind of like, be a part of these coming of age ceremonies and start to change those and alter them and alter the representations and what you see, right? Just kind of, even if it's something that, originated as part of, a patriarchal type thing that, for decades and decades and even centuries has, reinforced heteronormativity and men at the top and white men at the top and kind of power and privilege in these ways, right? We now have these kind of alternative expressions, right? And representations, right? We don't just kind of look around and see all, teen, cisgender boys and teen cisgender girls, dancing together in their traditional outfits, right? We now have opportunities to kind of like see other expressions, right? And of course, right, that's going to happen more or less depending on where you live. And so I do think that's starting to happen. And I do think, I think parents are starting to be made, just not everywhere, but in plenty of places, more uncomfortable by their kids pushing back, right? I hear parents like saying sometimes, like, my kid is like in 3rd and 4th grade and they're saying they're gender non-binary. What the heck is that? Like, where are they learning about that? Right? And like, this has gone too far. Right? Well, maybe it's that your kid has actually like had a choice, and maybe that's a hat they're trying on for right now. And maybe that's a hat that will continue to feel like the right hat, or maybe it will shift. But they get to try that hat on more than they used to. And that wasn't part of your upbringing, but that's the direction that, right, even though society is still, right, far, far away from kind of really having the gender equity and just kind of, representativeness that we need, it is moving in that direction, right? Like, things are shifting and fluctuating, and more parents are having to feel uncomfortable. Yeah. Right? Because it's not the same for their kids. Society's not the same anymore, right? And kids are pushing those binary boundaries more than they used to.
Absolutely. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, maybe I should have started here, but I was thinking about how cynical some of us queer people can be when a group of guys get together, and how, like words like the men's movement and stuff, I just want to like roll my eyes so hard because I prejudge about how they're going to be like hotbeds of careless queer phobia. And, I just want to, but I have to,
like men's rights activists,
exactly.
Specifically.
And, and it's like, I have to remind myself that while sometimes, of course, that's true, that what's the alternative to punish these men, to shame them, to keep them siloed? And I can't help but wonder that if men were allowed to come undone in each other's arms, it might actually lessen queerphobia in the world. I mean, it's like, what do we want these cis men to heal, regardless of whatever harm they may have done in the past? I mean, people deserve redemption. Either we're all in this together or we're not. And I'm bringing this up because of the audience of this show tends to skew.
And also just to acknowledge, right, a very small sliver, right, of cis men that fall within those men's rights activists, but they get a lot of attention, and they're very toxic. And so it's important to talk about.
And it's on the forefront of many queer people's minds when we have conversations about masculinity, because they are so on the forefront. And so I'm speaking almost more to my audience who tends to skew queer and can, I can see thinking, I can sometimes as we have these episodes, I can hear their questions and their resistance in my head. And it's like, oh, great. Another conversation about nurturing masculinity. Wow. And I guess my own inner challenge to myself when I have those thoughts, because I do, is about all the redemption that I've experienced in my life. And the alternative is pretty bleak. And I guess what I was hoping is that you could speak to about how attending to our maybe mutual woundedness allows us to attend to the woundedness in others and speak to the magic that men bring. We alluded to the magic that children bring. Earlier, and I'm coming back to what we bookmarked, we talked about what is a man. If you can talk to some of the unique gifts that those we gender as men or describe as masculine bring to the world, and how that can be mutually redemptive and healing for us to create spaces where we can all share in that.
Yeah. Well, so just to clarify first, like, I don't necessarily feel like we've been nurturing masculinity. Yeah. I feel like we've more so been raising questions with traditional, more mainstream masculinities that can be wounding and problematic in a lot of ways for boys' development and well-being. I focus on boys more, to be honest, because I'm a child and adolescent psychologist, but also because I have more hope. I have more hope for boys, right? Because they've got more time to learn this stuff, and their social learning isn't quite as solidified. And as you're alluding to beautifully, like, there should be hope and compassion for all people, right? Even if you don't agree with their politics or their viewpoints or their belief systems, right? And when we think about people who, do the most awful things in society, most of those people had pretty ugly childhoods, didn't have somebody who loved them, didn't have somebody who gave them hugs, didn't have somebody who made them feel like they mattered, right? Which everybody needs. And so, right, I don't know how to bring the different groups and factions together in a way that can be healing, but society certainly needs it. And I think a starting point that you're alluding to is, right, can people, for periods of time, put down the political armor and the political guard and kind of connect over things that we can all relate to, right? We don't all have the same belief systems. We don't all kind of like have the same solutions to different problems, right? But we've all felt incredibly small and insecure at times, right? We've all felt incredibly unsure of ourselves and hurt, right? We've also had moments where we felt, right, hopefully, like for most of us at least, like great and hopeful, right? And there are things I'm passionate about, and there are things I'm really excited to do, right? And so, right, those are human things that transcend, right, the politics and the ideologies. And so it seems like if there's a way to kind of, connect over those human capacities that do get, pushed away by, the guy code, man box stuff, right? But to really kind of recognize that we all have this stuff, regardless of our belief systems. We all suffer in incredibly immense ways, as well as experience fulfillment and joy and inspiration, right? Like, can we try to lead with that first and foremost before engaging in these difficult, divisive dialogues that typically just get shut down and lead to people avoiding one another?
Oh, that's beautiful. And I just so thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. We're going to put all sorts of goodies in the show notes where you can find more about Christopher's work, read more about him, certainly a link to purchase his book, which I highly recommend if you have a young person in your life, if you're a caregiver, if you're working in the industry. I think there's so many different ways to glean lots of amazing information from this workbook. First of all, I love the fact that it's a workbook and it's not just a textbook, that it's participative, it's co-collaborative and all of that. And so we'll put all that in the show notes so you don't need to scribble anything down and make sure you're loaded up. But Christopher, I just want to say thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure. I was pinching myself for much of our conversation so I wouldn't start crying, which I know is kind of ironic given our topic, because I just kept thinking of what a wonderful dad you must be and how cool it is that these two little people have you in their life. And I think that's really neat. So thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks so much, Britt, and really appreciate the work that you're doing and the space that you give for these incredibly important conversations and also chances for us to connect together.
Well,
So,
dear
great to be
listener,
here.
you have made it through another hour of Not Going Quietly. Just as the tears are starting to fall, I couldn't pinch myself anymore. Thank you so much for joining us on this wild ride of masculinity and deconstructing manhood. We really appreciate it. We couldn't do without you. And until next time, we'll bid you adieu. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Not Going Quietly with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East.
Thanks so much for joining us on this wild ride as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
Check out our show notes for links, additional information, and episodes located on your favorite podcast platform.